In the silent shadows of an American mansion, filled with rare books and walls full of history, she went unnoticed, as if her light steps and careful hands were part of the furniture. She took care of the library with the same zeal as someone who keeps living memories. Every corner she cleaned, every dust she brushed away, was a gesture of affection for a man who never looked back. But when a new employee arrived, with heavy steps and no interest in books, something broke. And it was only when the smell of old pages disappeared that he felt the void left by her, a void impossible to be filled with any new hire. But time, silent and fair, reveals truths in the rhythm of regret. The story begins in the fall, when the yellowing leaves covered the entrance to the property, and the library seemed to breathe along with it. He barely knew the name of the woman who transformed that space into a silent sanctuary every day. Her presence was invisible, but essential, and by replacing her with someone with no love for detail, he lost not only the cleanliness but the soul of his library. The smell of the books, the softness in the air, the peace among the shelves, everything was gone. And only then, too late, did he ask himself who that woman was who never asked for anything, but left everything. The answer would come with time, and with the weight of regret. If this story has already caught your attention in the first few seconds, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It makes all the difference in helping more people find stories like this. Mornings at Whitmore Mansion began with the soft sound of the kettle and the soft tinkle of the bells at the back door. She always arrived at the same time, with light, silent steps, as if asking the ground for permission to step on it. She wore discreet clothes, her hair tied in a simple bun, and her eyes, oh, her eyes, were always attentive to the details that no one else noticed. She was the one who looked after the library with an almost sacred care. He wasn't part of the permanent staff, but his informal contract had been going on for years. The boss said she had been there forever, as if she were part of the property. And perhaps she was. She was the silence that didn't bother, the order that imposed itself without rigidity, the light scent of lavender that impregnated the pages of the books over time. The library was the heart of the house, not because it was used frequently, but because it was beautiful, imposing, worthy of being shown at dinner parties to impress. And that was precisely why it existed, to keep it in perfect harmony. No one saw her arrive, and few saw her leave. But the proof of her work was there. Books lined up, no dust, small arrangements of dried flowers changed according to the seasons. She knew where each title was, even without a catalogue. She recognized the authors by their themes, the classics by their spines, and the rare editions by their smell. When a book showed signs of wear, she would discreetly sew the inside with invisible thread and return it to the shelf as if nothing had happened. Mr. Whitmore, a middle-aged man who had inherited a fortune from investments and real estate, barely knew her name. He called her the library girl when he needed to speak to the housekeeper. He had never exchanged more than 2 or 3 sentences with her. To him, she was like an automated function. Someone took care of it, and that was enough. There were no questions, no thanks. She seemed to accept it naturally. There was something in the way she walked, a kind of quiet resignation, that made it seem as if she had it all figured out and no longer expected anything from anyone. What no one understood was that, for her, this work was not just an obligation. It was her respite, her peace. The world outside those walls was noisy, unfair, harsh. In the library she found refuge. Books were her confidants, and the dark corners where he cleaned were often the only places where he felt like he belonged. She could hear the walls tell stories, and she cared for them as one would care for a living thing. But all that was about to change, because someone new was coming, and the silence of the library would never be the same again. It was in the details that she placed what little affection she had left. As she wiped the highest shelves with a damp, almost unscented cloth, she murmured the names of the authors as if reciting an ancient prayer. Her slender fingers glided over the spines as if touching something sacred. There were titles there that no one had opened for decades, but she treated them as if each one held a secret, waiting to be rediscovered. When she found signs of age on the papers, a stain, a loose page, a torn cover, She corrected them silently as if she were healing wounds. He never charged her for this. He never even mentioned it. Her reward was something else, keeping alive the memory of forgotten things. She had learned early on that the world pays no attention to the hands that build silence. Since she was a child, she had been raised amid noise and neglect, in homes where everything was shouted and nothing was cared for. Perhaps that was why she had become so silent. Books had always been her escape. She would read in secret in her aunt's basement as a child, and later found in second-hand bookstores the same sense of belonging that she had never felt in the hugs that had been missing. Mr. Whitmore's library was for her an extension of her own heart, not because of its grandeur, but because no one there required her to speak. She just had to care. Every day she took the same route. She got off the bus 2 blocks early to walk among the trees, breathing in the morning air as if she were grateful for the air. When she arrived, she greeted the cook with a shy wave, left her bag in the same corner of the pantry, and put on her light apron, embroidered by herself with initials that no one ever noticed. Her routine was always silent, discreetly sweeping the corners, adjusting the crooked pictures on the walls, rearranging the books read by occasional visitors, opening the windows at just the right time so the breeze could circulate without damaging the old paper. And then she would sit for a few minutes in her favorite chair, hidden between 2 philosophy bookshelves. There she would breathe. There, sometimes, she would even cry, but in silence. She never dared to touch her bosses. Books, the most expensive ones, the signed ones, kept with symbolic locks in glass display cases. But she knew which ones they were. She knew which ones he liked to show off, even though he never read them. She knew which ones were bought just to impress guests. And yet she took care of them with the same care as the others, because she understood the value of things, even when others didn't see it. On certain days, she would place small dried flowers between the pages of old works. No one noticed, but she knew that one day someone would open one of those books and find the gesture, and perhaps for a moment they would feel that they had been loved by someone they didn't know. She loved without being seen. She served without being remembered. And yet she continued, until that day when everything changed. The day when a conversation in the hallways decided, without consultation, that the library needed someone more modern, more efficient. And so, amid formal smiles and cost spreadsheets, the future arrived, cold as a forgotten draft. Mr. Whitmore was not a cruel man. He was simply the kind of person who gets used to comfort and forgets to look at who provides it. He grew up among inheritances, private clubs, and prestigious universities, where people's value was always related to what they could deliver, preferably quickly and without friction. The mansion he had inherited from his father was more a symbol of his success than a real home. The books, the artwork, the antique furniture, everything was part of a frame built to impress. For him, the library was the most important piece of this silent showcase, not because he read, but because it was where he received his most important guests. And so, everything had to be impeccable. Always. Despite this, he rarely spent more than 5 minutes a week in the room. Sometimes he would use it as a backdrop for virtual meetings, a glass of wine in hand and the camera set to show the most impressive titles in the background. Other times he would simply go in to pick up a book that seemed relevant to a given meeting, though he would never read it. The library was an extension of his image, but he had no idea who kept it alive. He didn't know the name of the woman who restored the worn spines. She never noticed that the books changed positions according to the season, or that the dried flowers matched the weather of the month. He thought it all just happened. And like many people accustomed to privilege, he believed that the silence of others was confirmation of duty fulfilled, not invisibility. The other employees didn't know much about her either. The cook treated her with respect, but not intimacy. The housekeeper preferred to keep her distance, fearing that too much closeness would make her feel weak enough to recognize a woman who did so much for next to nothing. And Whitmore himself, when he passed her in the hallways, barely took his eyes off his cell phone. Sometimes he would say a mechanical good morning, which he didn't always expect a response. He never asked about her life. He never imagined that she took 2 buses a day. He never realized that, even on days of heavy rain, she would show up with wet shoes but with her books intact. It was as if to him she was part of the furniture, something useful, functional, with no history of her own. And then, like any man who confuses practicality with efficiency, he decided that he could improve everything with a simple cut. The decision was not his directly. It came from a financial consultant hired to cut unnecessary costs. The library was not a priority. The cleaning could be done by another professional, from the rotating team. There was no need to pay for someone who only cleaned books. The sentence was said like that, cold, technical, and he signed the document without thinking twice. He didn't even bother to tell her in person. The news was passed on by the housekeeper, with a choked voice and downcast eyes. "They're making changes," she said, and the girl from the library just nodded, holding back her tears with the same strength with which she held the heavy books she arranged every day. She didn't argue. She didn't ask for an explanation. She knew deep down that she had always been invisible, and now they were only confirming it. The following week, a man entered through the same back door she had used, but without asking permission from the floor. He was wearing a tight t-shirt with a third-party company logo, headphones hanging from his neck, and a shiny badge like a trophy. He was carrying a cart with generic cleaning products, scratchy cloths, and a tablet on which he read the day's tasks. His name was Craig, and although he had no ill intentions, his presence carried the discomfort of anything that is displaced. He had no connection whatsoever to books. For him, cleaning was a practical task, dusting, wiping, marking as done in the system. The library, once a sanctuary of living silence, became an ordinary room, treated with the coldness of someone who does not see the stories among the shelves. The first thing Craig did was to stack the books that were out of place. He said, "Messy." These were precisely the volumes she had purposely left close at hand, so that someone might want to reread them. Then he removed the dried flowers from the corners, throwing them away without understanding the purpose. He found a note hidden between 2 pages, a short poem she had left in an old edition of Neruda, and crumpled the paper without reading it. He wiped the covers with a damp cloth without worrying about being delicate, spreading an artificial citrus scent that drowned out the soft perfume that had previously lived there. And finally he closed the windows to avoid drafts, without knowing that air was part of the soul of that space. On the first day, no one commented. On the second, the housekeeper noticed that the central bookshelf was different, colder, but kept the observation to herself. On the third, Mr. Whitmore joined a video conference and, without realizing it right away, felt something strange in the air. He couldn't name it. He sat down in his usual chair, looked at the back of the screen, and adjusted the frame as he always did. But for some reason, it took him longer than usual to concentrate. There was something in the environment that bothered him, like a musical note out of tune. The camera was correct, the lighting was adequate, but the setting seemed dead. The books no longer seemed to breathe with him, and without understanding exactly why, he ended the meeting earlier than usual. Craig continued his impersonal routine, erasing all traces of the woman who had been there for years. In a short time, the library became just another room in the house. The books, although still in place, lost the silent order she created. Some began to mold around the edges. Others were inverted, misaligned, even damaged by excessive humidity or neglect, and no one seemed to really notice. It was as if the space had lost its soul, but how could one name the absence of the invisible? The boss, immersed in his own business, did not relate the loss to the departure of the former employee. For him, nothing had officially changed. But inside the library, time was beginning to weigh on him, and the silence, once peaceful, now screamed. As the weeks passed, the discomfort that had once seemed subtle began to take root. Mr. Whitmore, without ever saying it out loud, began to avoid the library. He told himself he was too busy, that online meetings were better in his office, that books were out of fashion. But the truth was that every time he entered the room, he felt a strange unease. It wasn't just the artificial smell of chemicals, or the dust that insisted on returning to corners that had once seemed impervious to time. It was something deeper, an absence he couldn't explain, as if the place had been emptied of something. You never realized was there. One night he sat in the library chair trying to concentrate on reading a contract. The room was spotlessly clean, but cold. The light, despite being well positioned, seemed too harsh. The silence, which had once been welcoming, now weighed on his shoulders. He picked up a book from the shelf without thinking, a rare edition of Oscar Wilde, and, upon opening it, noticed a dark mark on the first page. He ran his fingers suspiciously and realized it was mold. He frowned. How was that possible? The library had always been immaculate. He turned a few pages. More stains appeared. He got up. He went to the second shelf. He opened another book. Same thing. A stuffy smell. Pages stuck together. Small deformations in the cover. Suddenly the annoyance became irritation. He called the housekeeper the next morning. She entered cautiously, already imagining what it could be. He, with the book in his hands, asked in a neutral tone, "Did you see this?" She nodded. Slowly. She said that she had already noticed the different books, that Craig didn't do the same job as the previous one, that perhaps it was time to reconsider the decision. But he dodged her. "We don't have the budget for that right now," he replied, as if he wanted to end the subject. But the image of the stained pages didn't leave his mind for the rest of the day. He began to remember details that he had never noticed before, the discreet flowers, the soft smell, the books always in the right place, the breeze that naturally circulated through the open windows. Everything had disappeared without him noticing. And it was in that silence that doubt began to weigh. Who was that woman again? What was her name? When was the last time he had really looked at her? He was sure he had never asked her if she needed anything. He had never thanked her. He didn't even know the day she stopped coming. He had just noticed one day that there was someone else in her place. How was it possible? That someone so present had passed through his life without leaving a mark, and yet now her absence was permeating everything? Craig, on the other hand, went about his predictable days. He mopped the floor, marked tasks on the app, and quickly cleaned the shelves, now without any care. Once he dropped an old book on the floor and simply pushed it back with his foot, not noticing that some pages had come loose. When the housekeeper pointed it out, he shrugged. "These things are too old. They need replacing." The phrase echoed through the house like an insult, but no one responded. Inside Whitmore, something was beginning to stir. It wasn't guilt yet. It was discomfort, a vague sense that he had lost something much bigger than the work of a silent employee. He didn't know it yet, but he was on the verge of realizing that some presences are only felt when they become absences, and the price of that, in time, would become an unpayable debt. In early December, when the air was beginning to cool and the windows of the mansion creaked in the dry winter wind, the library seemed more abandoned than ever, even though it was still there, intact. It was strange how its absence made the place feel different, as if the wood of the shelves had lost its warmth, and the books, silent and still, were in mourning. The curtains were no longer opened at the right time. The dust had crept back into the highest corners, and most importantly, the smell had changed. That faint scent of lavender and old paper, which no one had previously commented on but which had given the place its identity, was now replaced by a sour odor of expired disinfectant mixed with stagnant air. And it was in this almost imperceptible detail that everything began to weigh on Whitmore. One morning, while searching for an old volume to give to a member, he realized he couldn't find the copy he wanted. He looked in the French literature section, and then in the classics. The order of the bookshelves had been changed, without logic or soul. It was as if the books had been rearranged by someone who didn't know any of them, as if they had been shoved where they fit, without judgment or respect. Whitmore, impatient, called the housekeeper and asked where the book was. She hesitated, said that it might be in the restoration wing, but then remembered that that wing had no longer existed since the library girl had been laid off. The minor repairs room, the binding materials, the notebooks, they had all been boxed up and donated weeks before, on the orders of the administration. He nodded silently, swallowing hard, and said no more. In the days that followed, her memory began to invade his mind like an ancient breeze. He vaguely remembered her almost invisible presence, the way she glided between the shelves without making a sound, her simple clothes and the bun held together by a pencil. He remembered that she was always there, even if he never knew the exact day. And then he wondered, why had he never offered her coffee? Why had he never thanked her? Why did he know more about the supplier of his Oriental rugs than about the woman who had looked after his library for so many years? He began to notice that the books seemed sad. Yes, it was a silly thought, but it was real to him. The pages felt heavy, the papers dry, the titles faded. He touched them and felt no pleasure anymore. The library had become just another room, and with that, something inside him began to break. Whitmore was not a spiritual man. He had never believed in signs or in the energy of places, but one night that December he had sat there for hours, unable to read, just staring at the still bookshelves. He remembered a time when the place had seemed to breathe. Now it was a body without a soul. And in that absolute silence, for the first time, he felt a pang of real regret. Not for having replaced a servant, but for having completely ignored the humanity of someone who could transform a room into a sanctuary. Without ever being seen, it was too late to change what he had done. But what I didn't know yet was that fate has strange ways of returning what we neglect, and that certain gestures, no matter how small, when ignored, turn into absences that scream. On Christmas week, the mansion was covered in cold, glittering decorations installed by paid decorators. Nothing about it smelled like home. Everything was meticulously rehearsed to look perfect, but the emptiness between the glittering objects was almost palpable. In the library, no wreaths had been hung, no lights, no decorations. It was as if the space had been forgotten even by those who ran it, and Whitmore, for the first time in years, chose to spend Christmas Eve there alone with a glass of bourbon in his hand and a coat thrown over his shoulders. He stared at the books with teary eyes, as if searching for an answer he could not find. He remembered an old scene, with no set date. She, with her hair damp from the rain, would enter. Through the service door, take off the wet scarf from her neck and hang it discreetly behind the pantry door. Even so, she began her work with the same care as always. She never complained, and even when it was cold, she would spend hours among the shelves, replacing the books in silence. He remembered when she had found a torn book and spent days repairing the stitching with cotton thread and craft glue. He had noticed the difference, but had not asked who had done it. Now each memory came, back with a thin, cutting guilt. Walking through the bookshelves that night, his fingers touched a blue-covered copy, a memoir by a nearly forgotten American writer. As he opened it, a pressed petal fell from between the pages. It was a dried flower, still showing traces of color. Small, fragile. And there, next to the flower, was a dingy piece of paper with a handwriting he didn't immediately recognize. It was a handwritten quote, "That which is done with love remains even in absence." He read it and felt a lump in his throat. That handwriting was hers, and that gesture, silent and intimate, struck him like a sentence. He stood there, with the note between his fingers, not knowing what to do. There was no one to apologize to. There was no way to undo the neglect. For the first time, he felt that he had failed in something that money could not fix. The library, his most valuable exhibit, now condemned him in silence. And ironically, it was through the books that she had left marks that he could not erase. Small gestures, small symbols, hidden petals, forgotten poems, silent notes. Everyone was now screaming. And he, who had never had the sensitivity to notice her presence, now felt her absence like an emptiness inside his chest. He tried to react. He had some damaged books restored. He hired a conservator, but nothing was the same. Nothing had the softness she left behind. The touch of others was technical, distant. The breeze that used to come in the morning no longer returned. The books were alive but silent. And with that, Whitmore began to understand that some souls give themselves so much to places that, when they leave, they take with them everything that was true there. A few days after Christmas, an old friend of Whitmore's stopped by for an informal visit. He was a literature professor at a local university and loved to talk about the books that decorated the library. As he entered the room, He stopped for a few seconds, frowned, and said, matter-of-factly, "It seems the books have lost their scent." It was a casual phrase said without any intention of hurting, but for Whitmore it felt as if the ground had cracked beneath his feet. He tried to hide it, answering with a wry smile. "It's all in your head." But inside something snapped. The phrase hammered into his mind for the rest of the conversation. He could no longer hear his friend. All he could think about was the absence of that subtle aroma that he had never known how to appreciate until he heard that it had disappeared. Later, he was alone in the room. He sat down and for the first time took a deep breath, trying to find the scent he had never consciously noticed, but now knew was there. He found only a faint smell of mold and dry wood. He felt ridiculous, burying his face in the books like a man trying to smell memories. But it wasn't ridiculous. It was real. It was what she left there, every day, with her restrained presence and careful hands. It was the invisible mark of unrecognized love. And now everything smelled of absence. He made up his mind to go to the basement of the house where they had stored some old boxes from the administration. He rummaged through files and spreadsheets until he found a folded piece of paper with the housekeeper's notes. There, among the lists of employees, her name stood out clearly for the first time. Margaret Ellen Foster, library maintenance, monthly freelance. The handwriting was simple. The name was common, but to him it sounded like a revelation. Margaret, that was her name. How had he never asked? How could he have been so blind? With the name in hand, he began to search. He called the accounting firm. They said she had no formal bank account and was paid in cash. He called the transportation company and found out that she had been taking the same bus for years, always at 6 and 10 in the morning. But no one else knew. The housekeeper, embarrassed, confessed that Margaret had been extremely discreet. "She never said much, but I know she had a granddaughter. She lived far away, I think. She mentioned it once, but I didn't ask anymore." Whitmore felt small. He realized that everyone, including himself, had gotten used to not asking, to not seeing. In a confused attempt at repair, he ordered flowers, lavender, dried daisies, chamomile. He scattered them discreetly among the books. It wasn't the same. It was a theater, a soulless replica. The books remained silent. The corners dead. But inside him something was stirring. It wasn't just guilt, it was a longing I didn't even know I could feel. The longing for a silent presence that made the place something alive, and the fear that perhaps in time he would forget the sound of her footsteps, the perfume left between the pages, the care in her gestures. And it was in this emptiness, in this silence filled with absence, that karma began to take shape. Not as a violent punishment, but as that subtle sadness that corrodes from within unhurriedly, reminding us every day of what we lose when we don't pay attention to what really matters. Early on a Monday morning, Whitmore woke up with a start. He had dreamed of books falling from the shelves, a strong wind blowing through the pages, and a female figure walking through the aisles wearing a light dress and loose hair, but without a face. The dream said nothing in words, but the feeling was clear. Absence. An absence that screamed suffocatingly. He got up, put on his robe and went to the library in the dark. He didn't turn on the lights. He sat in the armchair with his hands clasped together and remained there like a defendant awaiting trial. For the first time, he cried, a restrained, almost childish cry, as if only then did he understand the extent of the loss. The next morning, she went to the corner of the library where she usually kept her work items, a space behind a false bookcase, hidden from view. When she pushed lightly on the wooden panel, she felt a creak and found a small box. Inside were cotton cloths, jars of dried herbs, an unnamed hardcover book, and at the bottom, an old notebook with a hand-embroidered fabric cover. Opening it, it was like entering a temple. There were pages and pages of notes about the books in the library, personal observations, records of small repairs, favorite passages, cleaning dates, and even random thoughts. Today I found a petal between the pages of Whitman, as if the book was giving me back. The rain fell hard, but the books were dry. It makes me feel like I belong here. He walked right past me and didn't see me, but that doesn't bother me. The books see me. As he read those words, he felt something irreversible pass through him. She had left there not only a record of her work, but a diary of her soul. Each sentence revealed a woman who loved books as if she loved herself, who found meaning in what she did, even without recognition, and above all, someone who knew how to create beauty in silence. His hands were shaking. I couldn't keep reading. He carefully closed the notebook and pressed it to his chest. That was more than a memory. It was a request to be heard that was never heard. From that day on, every morning began with a visit to the library. Not to work, but to read a page from his notebook. And each new reading brought back a new memory. Vaguely, he began to remember how she adjusted her glasses on her face, how her perfume seemed different every season. He remembered a day when she had tripped on a rug and apologized, as if she were guilty of existing. And he had simply nodded, without even looking her in the eye. Now, those images came to him like slow razors. He tried to find her through formal means. He hired an assistant to track down people with that name. He found 2 Margaret Fosters in the state. He called one of them, an 82-year-old woman who had never set foot in a library. The other didn't answer. He sent letters. No response. And with each failed attempt, the weight grew heavier. It wasn't just that he couldn't find her. It was that it had taken him so long to look. It was that he had only noticed her when he had run out of time. And that, he knew, could never be undone. Weeks passed since he had found the notebook, and over time he began to see it as a reliquary. Each day he opened a new page, as if he were talking to someone who had left without saying goodbye. He began to read aloud, not because he expected to be heard, but because he felt that the words, as they echoed in the library, made the air move again. Little by little, he noticed that the morning light seemed different when it came through the windows, that the sound of the wood creaking on the floor had a different tone. It was not an illusion. It was him finally, truly feeling the place. But this realization did not bring relief. It brought pain. The pain of someone who recognizes the value of something only when he can no longer give back. On one of the final pages, she found something different. It was a collage made of old paper clippings with a bold phrase, "Everything done with love leaves marks that time cannot erase." Below it, a handwritten passage. "If someone ever reads this, I hope it didn't take them as long as he did to understand what was in here." He closed the notebook with trembling hands. This was about him. It was for him. And yet, at the same time, it was as if she had never expected it to be read. Maybe she had written it for herself, or for the future, or for no one. But now it was an open letter to her conscience. That night he couldn't sleep. He got up before dawn and went to the library. He gathered all the books she had restored, the ones with petals, notes, signs. He took them apart, cleaned them gently, and for the first time felt like he was caring for them the way she had. He called an old bookbinder in town. He asked him to restore the damaged volumes, not as works of art, but with respect. He said he wanted to preserve not the books, but the silent stories that came with them. The bookbinder, not understanding the weight of those words, simply agreed. But for Whitmore, this was a small way to start giving back. In early spring, he organized an intimate exhibition. He didn't tell the press. He invited only a few friends, teachers, and local librarians. In the center of the library, he placed a table with the restored books, and next to it was Margaret's notebook, open to a page where she had written, "Those who care for the unseen must also be seen." Above the table, he discreetly had engraved in bronze, "In memory of Margaret Foster, unseen keeper of stories." There were no speeches, just silence. A different silence, this time reverent. During the presentation, a woman approached the table. She looked at the notebook with moist eyes. She was a librarian from a nearby town. She said the name sounded familiar. She mentioned that years ago, a quiet employee with that name had worked at a public school and had left without saying goodbye, leaving behind only notes and dried flowers in the children's books. Whitmore felt his chest tighten. It was her. Always her. passing through places, leaving marks that only appeared when his eyes finally opened to the essentials. But the reunion had not yet arrived, and time held one more page before the end. The library was a different place now, still silent, still full of books, but there was something different about its atmosphere. It wasn't a visible change. It was as if the air had become lighter, as if, after so long, the room had begun to breathe again. Margaret's notebook remained open on the main table, and new people came to visit that space every day. Students, teachers, curious people. Everyone sat for a while, read a page or two, and left in silence, as if they had been touched by something they couldn't name. Whitmore kept his distance. He observed discreetly, respectfully. He had stopped, using the space as a showcase. He no longer showed it at meetings, nor did he show it to guests. The library had become, for him, a sacred place, not of religious worship, but of memory, an altar built with repentance and learning. In silence, he began to write. Small excerpts, fragments of thoughts, memories. Inspired by Margaret's delicate style, he tried to put on paper what he had never been able to say out loud. Forgiveness is not a word. It is a process. Absence teaches with steady hands. It took me a while to see the one who gave me everything without asking for anything. Short sentences, but charged with a new pain. Conscience. It was late in the afternoon, when the light filtered through the cracks in the wood like a golden veil, that he heard discreet footsteps approaching the library. They were different. They did not have the weight of visitors. They had the rhythm of someone who knew the place. When he looked up, he saw a young woman standing at the entrance. She was wearing a simple dress, her hair tied up with a flowered scarf, and her dark, attentive eyes. In her hands, she carried a yellowish envelope. She was silent for a few seconds before introducing herself. "My name is Anna. Margaret was my grandmother." The sentence fell like a contained thunderclap. Whitmore stood up with difficulty, not knowing what to say. The young woman smiled sweetly and continued, "She spoke little, but sometimes she wrote about this place. I found the address among her things, and I wanted to see it for myself." He offered the chair. She entered with soft steps. She observed the room with tenderness, as if recognizing something she had never seen before. She touched one of the carefully restored books. Then she opened the notebook, and upon seeing her grandmother's handwriting, her eyes filled with contained tears. Inside the envelope he carried were letters, excerpts of poems, and a few faded photographs. One showed Margaret standing beside a bookshelf right there in the library, with a faint smile on her face. It was a picture Whitmore had never seen before. Anna placed the photo on the table next to the notebook. She said this was the only place where she felt peace, and that she didn't need to be seen to make something beautiful. I thought that was an exaggeration. Now I understand. Emotion filled the room, but no one cried out loud. There was a respectful silence. Anna asked to come back again. She said she wanted to keep her grandmother's memory alive by taking care of the books. He nodded, his eyes brimming with tears. She smiled slightly and before leaving turned and said, "She thought no one would ever notice, but you noticed, even if it was late." And with that, she left the library, taking with her something that could not be carried in one's hands, the bridge between the past and redemption. From that day on, Anna visited the library every Tuesday. She had a calm, observant manner, much like her grandmother. She touched the books with reverence, walked slowly among the shelves, carefully picking up any signs of neglect. Over time, she brought in some of her own materials, a small bristle brush, cotton cloths, jars of lavender essence. She didn't ask for permission. She just started doing it. And Whitmore, seeing her, sensed that she wasn't a replacement. She was an extension, an echo of what was gone. He never formally hired her, nor did she ask. It was as if there was a silent pact between them made of respect and purpose. On his second visit, Anna gave him a new notebook. "I think someone should keep writing." It was identical to his grandmother's, an embroidered fabric cover, handmade stitching, blank pages waiting to make sense. He took a while to accept it, but that night he wrote his first sentence. Absence teaches what presence sometimes silences. And from then on, he began to write down everything. Not about business, not about books, but about feelings, about what he learned each day, about the regret that didn't disappear but that no longer crushed, only shaped. The library became a living space again, not because of the dried flowers or the perfume that had once again filled the air, but because now there was a memory, there was a name, there was a legacy. Visitors began to leave notes between the pages, small tributes. A boy left a drawing, a woman, a poem. A university professor wrote that this place had restored his faith in kindness. And Whitmore silently began to collect everything. He kept each gesture as if it were a prayer. It was his way of paying off a debt that would never be repaid. One morning, when he opened Margaret's notebook, he found a folded page that he had not yet read. In it was a text dated the last year she had been there. It said, "If I could ask anything of the future, I would ask only that this place never lose its soul. Because books by themselves are just paper. What gives them life is care. It is love." For the invisible. When he finished reading, Whitmore took a deep breath. He realized that without even knowing it, he had fulfilled his request. And perhaps, in a twisted way, he had been redeemed by it. Anna brought new ideas. She proposed small reading sessions, silent circles, candlelit poetry evenings. He supported them all, not for marketing purposes, but because he now understood what it meant to make room for the subtle. One night she asked him, "Do you regret it?" He took a while to answer. Then he said, "I regret it every day, but not for not having seen it. I regret it for having taken so long to look." She nodded, and in that gesture, without words, there was a kind of forgiveness. The past could not be changed. Margaret would not return. But her presence was now stronger than ever. It was in the air, in the touch of the books, in the watchful eyes of her granddaughter. And Whitmore, who had once built his life on ostentation, now discovered that the greatest legacies are made of simple gestures and of love that asks for no recognition. On the one-year anniversary of the exhibition in honor of Margaret, the library received more visitors than ever. The day dawned with pale skies, and a warm breeze passed through the mansion's garden, making the dry leaves dance like small whispers of time. Anna prepared everything with care. She rearranged the most delicate books, scattered lavender petals in discreet spots, and lit a white candle on the central table, next to her grandmother's notebook. There were no speeches, no music, no pomp. It was a ceremony made of silence and presence, like everything Margaret was. Whitmore, thinner and with greying hair, walked slowly among the visitors. He no longer wore the starched suits he had worn before. He was dressed in simple clothes, his eyes marked by something that was not weariness, but transformation. He stopped in front of the bookcase where he had found the first petal. He ran his fingers over the wood and closed his eyes. What had once been just a piece of furniture now carried memories. Every crack, every groove, every crooked book bore the mark of someone who had cared for it, even if they couldn't see it. As the afternoon drew to a close, an elderly woman came in through the side door. She wore a grey felt hat, a wooden cane, and an old woolen scarf. No one recognized her at once. She walked slowly to the central table and stood there, staring at the open notebook. Anna, seeing her, approached. Cautiously. "Can I help you?" she asked gently. The woman looked up. Her eyes were full of tears. "My name is Beatrice. I worked with Margaret many years ago, at a school. She talked about you." Anna could not contain her astonishment. Beatrice continued. "She said that you were her hope, that even if the world did not see you, you would one day understand what it is to see with your heart." Anna hugged her silently. Then Beatrice pulled an old yellowed envelope from her pocket. She gave this to me before she left. She asked me to give it to you if I ever met you. I almost threw it away, but something told me I should keep it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. It was a letter, written by Margaret. The handwriting was firm, and each word seemed to carry a light weight, as if whispering straight from eternity. "If this letter has reached you, it is because time has done its work. Do not regret what you did not see. True love does not demand recognition. It simply exists. I took care of your library because it took care of me in return, and perhaps even if silently you also saw me, in your own way. If you miss me now, it is because in some way I was part of you, and that is enough. Take care of what is left. Let the beauty continue. Because books have a smell, yes, but they also have memories. When she finished reading, Anna handed the letter to Whitmore. He received it with a mixture of reverence and pain. He couldn't read it at the time. He put it in the inside pocket of his jacket and stared at the notebook in silence. Beside him, a child was leafing through a book with fingers still stained with colored pencils. She had left a drawing inside the pages. A woman with her hair tied up, surrounded by books and flowers. No name, but with a soul. That night, Whitmore returned to the library alone. He sat with the letter in his hands, read each word slowly, and for the first time, he smiled with peace. Not with forgiveness, but with acceptance. He knew he would never be the same man, and that, despite everything, Margaret had changed him, not with accusations, but with silence, with patience, with care. Before leaving, he turned off the lights, but he left a candle lit on the notebook, and there, in that simple gesture, was all the redemption possible for a man who, out of pride, had been slow to look, but who had finally learned to see. If this story touched you in any way, leave a like now. This shows us that it's still worth telling stories about people that almost no one sees. Write in the comments, "I smelled the books," and help keep alive the memory of those who care in silence. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because every week we bring real, touching, and meaningful stories like this one. And now click on the video that is appearing on the screen. It is a story as moving as this one, and it can make you see the world with different eyes.